Good morning, everyone. For those of you who follow the daily reading plan, we would have just recently have completed the book of Ecclesiastes, and you would have to agree with me that it surely is quite a remarkable book. While we all know from Paul in his letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 that all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, truly furnished unto all good works. And if we go and look at this same verse in the ESV, puts it slightly differently, I think slightly more clearer, but the opening part of that verse is quite interesting, and it says there, all scripture is breathed out by God. So we have this concept of God breathing out scripture, and we're going to come back to this particular concept later on. But we have in the various books in the Bible, those that are letters to various people or churches. We have books that deal with prophecies. We have books that are predominantly filled with historical accounts of what transpired to various people, specifically the Jews. And all of these have aspects that Paul mentioned and highlighted in them. But when we look at Ecclesiastes, where does it fit? Because as you start reading its chapters, you could be forgiven for, to be frank, getting a bit depressed. And so what I want to do this morning is just spend a bit of time looking at some background to Ecclesiastes so that we can be better able to appreciate why God gave us this book and how it can play a major role in providing us with doctrine, correction, instruction in righteousness, and so lead us to be more complete before God, equipped for every good work. But before we start, we need to look at who most likely wrote Ecclesiastes, because it doesn't specifically state who the author is. But establishing who wrote it goes a long way towards enabling us to not only know why God gave it to us, but the context and our understanding of it is greatly enhanced. So who wrote the book? The title Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly. So it makes sense that the author identifies himself in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 1 by the Hebrew word koheleth, and that has been translated for us as preacher. And despite leaving only this rather mysterious name to indicate his identity, evidence in the book, along with most Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests that King Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. The preacher, or this koheleth as he calls himself, titles himself the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and one who has acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And then in chapter 12 and verse 9, he brings out this point that he is one who has collected many proverbs. And Solomon, we know, followed David on the throne in Jerusalem, and he was the only Davidic son to rule over all Israel from that city. And we find this in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 12. We also know that he was the wisest man in the world during his time, and we can find this in 1 Kings chapter 4 and verses 29 to 30. And we also know from Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 1 that he wrote most of the book of Proverbs. And I think from this alone we can safely identify Solomon as the koheleth of the opening verse in Ecclesiastes. But when we marry what we read as the experiences the writer goes through in Ecclesiastes and marry that with the life of what we know about Solomon as we read Kings and Chronicles, I think we are led to the only conclusion, and that is that only a man of Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and position could put himself through the experiences we read about in Ecclesiastes and come to the conclusions that he did. In fact, it appears that one of the very reasons God gave Solomon all of this was to provide us with Ecclesiastes. So let's look at what happened to Solomon so that we have a full background on which to build our understanding of this remarkable book. And so the first verse we're going to go to from 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, we read there that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. And if we think about that statement, to have that said of one in Scripture is high praise indeed. That we are titled, or Solomon is in this particular case, as walking in the statutes of David his father. 2 verses later, we find that God says to Solomon in verse 5, ask what I shall give you. So as a result of what transpired in verse 3 in that commentary, God asked Solomon, whatever you want from me, I will give you. And notice here that God placed no restriction on what he could ask for or what he could have. And picture yourself or any human being finding themselves in this position, standing before the creator of the entire universe and being said that you could ask for anything. What would you or what would they ask for? And notice here that this is not just one wish, so to speak. If we compare it to the famous lamp that you rub and a genie pops out and the genie always gives you 3 wishes. God wasn't offering Solomon a limited number of wishes. It was an open-ended invitation. Ask what I shall give you. Solomon could have asked anything, any number of things. There was no limit on what he could have and how much he could have. So what does Solomon actually ask for? Well, we read in verse 9 of chapter 3, Solomon says to God, give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. Unlimited. And yet he asks for the wisdom and the understanding to be able to look after his people. A truly remarkable request. And God recognizes this. God replies in verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And so God grants the request and adds additional unasked for things. And so we find a record of this in verses 11 to 14. And God said to Solomon, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, now I do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. And that could have been the end of it, because that's really all Solomon asked for. But God continues, I'll give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. But when we read the record of Solomon's life in Kings and Chronicles, what do we find? Well, in chapter 10 and verse 23, we read, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. So that's exactly as God had promised him, that he would be richer than anybody else on the planet, that he would be wiser than anybody else on the planet. And 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 23 confirms that this is the case. And so, in reading that, that's all great at this point. But then we read the account in 1 Kings chapter 11. And notice the title of this chapter. It's titled, Solomon Turns from the Lord. And it is a sad account, a whole chapter devoted to this most blessed of men, granted everything somebody could ever want. And he turns his back on following God with all his heart and being led astray to go and worship other gods. And if we read 1 Kings chapter 11 in isolation, and by that I mean we only read about Solomon in Kings and Chronicles, we come to the conclusion that Solomon remains astray from God until his grave. Because we have this whole account in chapter 11, itemizing and detailing the manner in which Solomon turned his back on God and where he went astray. And the chapter then closes and concludes with these words in verses 41 to 43. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the books of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Now I've heard people debating as to whether Solomon will be in the kingdom or not, but based on our reading of 1 Kings chapter 11, there is absolutely no reason to think that he does have some last-minute change of heart and turns back to God. There's nothing sandwiched before that verse 41 to indicate that Solomon has changed tact and turned back to God. And if that is the conclusion of the matter, that God grants a man all the wisdom, all the wealth, all the status he could ever ask for, and this is where it ends up, then this truly is highly distressing. And so on that depressing note, let's take a break, and we're going to return shortly, where we will look at the second part of this talk, the actual conclusion of the matter, and what God is wanting to teach us.